Last weekend, I ran the Dresden Marathon. Did I get the sub 3 time I've been chasing? Let me take you through the race. A sub 3 hour marathon means running at 4 minutes and 16 seconds per kilometer for 42 kilometers and 195 meters. I tried that in Berlin 2021 and I failed. I tried it again 5 weeks ago in Berlin and I failed again. So, why was this going to be different? Well, really, the only thing I was hoping for was better weather, or maybe that should be worse weather. Berlin had reached 27 degrees, which models estimate can add 5 to 15 minutes onto your time, depending on your goal pace. In Berlin, I'd managed 3 hours, 5 minutes, and 51 seconds, so I was confident with a temperature of maybe 12 degrees or less, that sub 3 was on. And that's the first piece of good news. The forecast for Dresden was to peak at just 8 degrees, but with 32 km/h winds. However, the race was booked, the bib was collected, and the final carbs had been loaded. It was time for a good night's sleep. The day of the race, and having had my final measure of oats for breakfast, I headed to the stadium to meet my friend Dennis, who I planned to run with. We dropped off our bags and headed to the start line, wearing our ever fashionable bin bags. Yes, you do get some odd looks. We had quite a few of the cameras pointing at us, but they're an exceptionally effective choice, especially if the race doesn't offer clothes recycling points within the starting pens. With 3 minutes to go, we were still at the very front of the race, and realizing we probably weren't going to be challenging the top 10, we dropped back a few rows to find the sub 3 paces. At 10:30, the starting gun fired and we were on our way. No 7-minute wait like in Berlin, we were across the starting line within a second. There was a little bit of argy-bargy in the first few kilometers. It was a little bit crowded as the half marathon had started at exactly the same time. That being said, the crowds and the course was nothing on the scale of Berlin. The first 5 kilometers were pretty uneventful, bar one short, sharp hill that I wasn't expecting, and then we headed back south across the river. This was when I first felt the full force of the wind. Fortunately, we had a strong group of about 20 runners with us, and so I was able to tuck in for the most part, but it gave me a taste of things to come. By 10 kilometers, I was still feeling strong, but despite sitting in the slower of the two sub 3 hour pace groups, we went through the 10-kilometer mark at 41 minutes and 36 seconds, almost a minute too quick. I put this down to kind of the first few kilometers being quite exciting, but I made a conscious effort to slow down from there on. And I kind of managed this. The next 5 kilometers were 15 seconds too fast. So I saw 15 kilometers in at 1 hour, 2 minutes and 36 seconds. Regardless, it was quite nice to have that minute or so in the bank. At 17 kilometers, the half marathon runners peeled off towards the finish line and we headed back north of the river. This was a beautiful, surreal section with a really strong tailwind pushing you along, and you could see some people really kicking at this point. But as we weren't even halfway, there was no chance I was risking it. I've said it before and I had to reiterate it to myself during the race. My goal was to get a sub 3 hour time. 2:58 or even a 2:57 would be amazing, but just getting a time starting with a 2, that's really all I cared about. As we headed up and across the river again, we once again picked up a tailwind, except this section wasn't out and back. It's honestly a little bit daunting running with the wind pushing you forwards, knowing that you then have to run straight into that headwind barely a few kilometers later. At this point, my friend Dennis was feeling strong, so he kicked on to join the group in front. He dangled between the two groups for honestly what seemed like an eternity, I imagine only longer to him, but sensibly and fortunately made contact with the group just before we turned around to head into the headwind. My pack was now down to just 6 of us, and we selfishly tucked into a long straight line right behind the pacer, who was now metronomically tapping out 4 minutes and 14 kilometers. We headed through 30 kilometers in 2 hours, 5 minutes and 46 seconds. That's an average for the race so far of 4 minutes and 11 per kilometer.
Keep going, looking really great.
Now, anyone who's raced a marathon will tell you it doesn't start until this point. And that was spot on in my case. At 30 kilometers, we not only turned back into a headwind, but it started raining and we headed on to the only gravel section of the entire race. but I've been at this point before, most recently 5 weeks ago at the Berlin Marathon. And even though I was starting to fatigue, I felt so much better than I had in the heat, and I kicked on. I've been taking gels, one every 8 kilometers, and even though I didn't really feel like taking the fourth and final one at 32 kilometers, I knew it was the right decision. I looked down at my watch at just past 32k. 10 kilometers left to go and 45 minutes in which to do it if I was going to get that sub 3 hour time. Unlike Berlin, it wasn't over yet. I clocked off the next 4 kilometers and passed my partner for the final time, taking a bottle of water, so I didn't have to slow down for the final aid station. Spirits were high for the 5 or so of us left in our little group, knowing we only had to get through the final few kilometers along the waterfront. A lovely fellow called Jens got chatting with me. He said that talking helped him ignore the pain, and honestly, I was more than happy to listen to him regale the history of Dresden as we headed down to the river. But this is where it got really difficult. We'd always known that the final 4 kilometers would be a headwind the whole way. But as we passed through that final aid station, the rain really started to come down. And not just a shower like it had been before, it was raining cats and dogs. In fact, it was raining so heavily, I had to take off my glasses because I couldn't see through the lenses. My smart move of skipping the final water station turned out to actually be quite a poor one. Everyone who'd slowed down to get a cup was now sitting in my draft as we headed into that headwind. But some of the half marathon runners were still out on course, and despite going at quite a different pace, I was able to use them as targets and then mini moments of respite from that wind. I knew I'd lost time as I climbed up that final road towards the stadium, but I daren't look at my watch. Dennis was a couple of 100 meters ahead of me, possibly out of reach, but I put my head down and just focused on finishing strong, regardless of what my time was going to be. I entered the stadium, not quite to the rapturous applause I was maybe imagining in my head, but I kicked on and cruised down the finishing straight. I crossed the line, stopped my watch, and walked over to congratulate the runners I just spent the last 3 hours running with. But what was my time?
2:48:47? No. 2:58:47. Is that the right number?
2 hours, 58 minutes, and 47 seconds. As you can see, having got changed into something warmer and making the ill-advised decision to have a cold alcohol-free beer in temperatures which were pretty close to zero by this point, I could barely recall my time. But that's because all I knew is I'd achieved what I'd set out to do. I had raced to a sub 3. As any of you who have seen my other videos will know, there's a lot more to this than just running at 4 minutes and 16 kilometers for 3 hours. And I'm going to be breaking down what went well and what I maybe could have done a bit better over the coming weeks. So be sure to subscribe so you can follow along now that I've raced to sub 3. Oh, and as always, dog tags. Say goodbye, Emily. Yeah.